Optimal screen resolution. I don't know what that means. Huh?
It's going to be like the nutrition chapter. I'm not going to like now.
No.
If you're going on to nursing, though, I'd pay attention to this chapter.
Yeah, because this chapter is important. You know, clinically it's important. That's why it's included in the chapter, in the textbook. So when we talk about fluids in the body, it's important that all the fluids in your body remain in the places that they belong, or fluid compartments, in the proper distribution, so that all of the stuff that we've discussed in all of these systems, like exchange of nutrients and waste through the cardiovascular system, exchange of respiratory gases with respect to the respiratory system and cardiovascular system, it's important that ion balance be maintained so all of this exchange can take place. So when we talk about fluid, electrolytes, and acid balance, we're talking about fluid balance and exchange balance. Because we know there's tons of different factors that are going to drive exchange within fluid compartments. We have the pressure, we have concentration, pH can affect chemical reactions, temperature can affect chemical reactions. So fluid compartments in this chapter talks about the distribution of fluids within compartments and why they are important for exchange. So where does fluid live in the body? Well, lots of what you're made of is water. You're composed of a large percentage of water. And where does that water or fluid live? We have fluid that is inside cells, and we have fluid that is outside cells. So most of your fluid volume is where? Yeah, inside your cells. We call that intracellular fluid. So about 40% of your body weight is actually fluid that's inside your cells. When we talked way back in the beginning of our anatomy and physiology, when we talked about tonicity, we're going to hear those terms again in this chapter, the movement of fluid into and out of cells. And the rest of the fluid volume is outside cells, and that's what? Extracellular. Now, extracellular fluid can be in a couple of different places. It can be right outside your organs. And so we've talked about. Give me an example of some extracellular fluid that we've talked about. What's that called? Pericardial fluid. They're all serous fluid. Well, that's a different one. Peritoneal fluid, right? Pleural fluid. Outside organs, ascites fluid, synovial fluid. Okay, so that's all extracellular fluid, interstitial fluid. The other large portion of extracellular fluid is in our circulatory system, and that's blood plasma. So this is where most of our fluids hang out, either inside cells or outside cells in those two different compartments. And the concentration of electrolytes and non-electrolyte molecules are very important for exchange within these fluid compartments. So I know you're going to hate me, but we have to understand the difference between ion concentration inside and outside cells. So this diagram here shows us electrolyte composition of blood plasma, interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid. And we see that, if you look at this diagram, in blood plasma, there tends to be certain ions that are higher in concentration in blood plasma than they are in what? Or in extracellular fluids than they are in intracellular fluids. So the big ones that stick out for us, and we know this already because we discussed it during the nervous system, and we discussed it during the cardiovascular system, and we discussed it during the renal system. One of the big ones that sticks out for us is sodium. And the balance of sodium outside the cell versus inside the cell is extremely important. For what? Well, charge different. It sets up membrane potential. That sodium-potassium pump is the guy who's going to help keep these ion balances. Muscle contraction, nerve impulses, so many different things that you already know rely on the fact that there's more sodium outside the cells than there is inside. Water balance when we talk about the kidneys, renal function, obligatory water reabsorption, all of that stuff. So you see how this chapter is repeat of a lot of the things you know. So what I want you to know from this is I want you to know some of the major ions that we see more outside the cell than we do inside the cell. And pretty much sodium is the guy that sticks out for us. Inside the cell, one of the major ones we see is potassium. So just a general idea of some of these ions and their concentration, which ones are more concentrated inside than outside cell. The other very important anion, what's an anion? Thank you, hon.
Negative.
No, cation is negative, anion is, and again, you know this from when? Chapter chemistry, right? Okay, so this is all the stuff. Oh crap, I have to know that? Yeah, you're going to hear it. You're going to tap on a lot of old information in this chapter too.
Anion is negative.
It's a negatively charged,
And cation is
positively charged, correct? Inside the cell, interstitial, intracellular versus outside the cell, we see lots more of these negatively charged proteins. And these are the guys that are going to be part or a large part of setting up membrane potential. Now what was membrane potential? This is the plasma membrane.
more sodium outside.
Well, think of charge.
No, the inside is negative, more negative.
Correct.
Than outside.
So the inside is more negatively charged than the outside. You know, and people, and why I want you to think that way, because sometimes people get confused and they say, well, potassium is a positive ion. How come it's higher in concentration? Why don't we have a positive charge on the inside of that cell? It's because of these guys. So these are the guys that are going to contribute to that negative charge.
Hydrogen phosphate.
Yep.
Is another
And those are part of what we're going to discuss in this chapter, are buffer systems. These are the guys that are going to help keep ion balance, help keep pH balance, and hydrogen ion concentration in check. So those are some of the major players involved in creating membrane potential. The thing you don't have to worry about, you don't have to be able to calculate milli equivalents and all of that based on charge. Not going to go there. So don't worry about that. The calculation you see on page 992 in your textbook, don't worry about it. Do worry about who's inside versus outside. Again, that diagram on page 992. So fluid movement between these compartments is where, and again, we've talked about throughout this entire semester, different systems in the exchange of nutrients and wastes. We have exchange because of different reasons. And again, repeat information. We talked about things like bulk flow. We talked about diffusion. We talked about osmosis. We talked about water in relation to creating pressure gradients. Terms we're going to see in this chapter: osmotic pressure and hydrostatic pressure. Yes?
Why our proteins are negative charged
It's just the way because they have more,
or negative ions?
well, the molecule, the atoms that make them up, we tend to have more electrons in the molecule when it's finished than protons. So that's why it's negative. So water and water balance is going to help drive movement of a lot of these electrolytes through fluid compartments. And the pressure created by water is going to do that as well. So some of the major sources of water intake and output are discussed in this chapter as well. So we take in a lot of water, we put out a lot of water. There should be a balance between the two, correct? So the water we take in, we should put out over and above the water we need to maintain our fluid compartments. So the average intake per day is mostly from what? Stuff that you drink. So your coffee, your water, your Pepsi are all things that you ingest in beverage form. And that's most of the intake that you have. Also, foods that you eat. There are some animals that never drink. Never drink. Where do they get their water from? Well, the foods that they eat. No, fish actually drink. But there's some desert-dwelling animals that don't drink. They get their fluids from the things that they eat. So, but we, on the other hand, we need to drink. Foods, about 30%. And then reactions of metabolism also can create water. What do we call that? Metabolic water. How's that? So the reaction of cellular respiration, one of the waste products of part of that reaction was water. So we create water through reactions of metabolism. About 10% of the water created is created by metabolism.
Aren't there some foods that can produce like a lot of water, like for example watermelon?
There's a lot of foods that contain a lot of water, exactly. And that's those animals tend to eat, you know, when you, for example, in the desert, cacti produce fruits. So there's a lot of water content in those fruits that those animals eat.
When my grandmother had a heart problem, she had a paper that told her what food she could and couldn't eat, and water, because she was very sensitive to her water balance being off, and then
Yep.
would come with it, and watermelon, cantaloupe, like pretty much all the melons I remember were off limits because they take so much water.
Exactly, exactly. And you can see that when you eat some of those foods during the summer that you tend to have to void a little bit more than other times. So yes, that is very true. So input has to equal output, so we keep balance, homeostasis. Most of the water leaves our body in the form of what? Urine. So the renal system has a big job, water balance in the body. We also get rid of water through skin. And even though it's freaking cold out there, are you still losing water from your skin? Absolutely. When you breathe out, lungs, but I'm talking about sweating. Exactly, exactly. Because what's happening to your environments in the wintertime? They're drier. So things tend to go from a high concentration, you, to a low concentration, the atmosphere. So if you have wood burning fire or wood stove, what do they tell you to do?
Put a pot of water on.
Put a big pot of water on there so you can get more moisture into your environment so your skin won't dry out as much. So insensible loss via skin and breathing out. How do they test to see if somebody's alive? They put the little mirror in front of their, and what happens to the mirror when they breathe out? Correct. That water vapor. So, sweat.
Breathed out and she thought, she goes, Mama, I'm smoking. I'm like,
Well, kind of. Well, you're steaming. You're steaming, not smoking. So sweat and then feces. Even though it's a very small amount, we still lose some through feces as well. So different body mechanisms are constantly monitoring how much water versus dissolved substances we have in our bodies. Constantly monitoring, the term I use for that is osmolality. So fluid osmolality, concentration of dissolved substances in that fluid, is constantly being monitored. Now, who monitors it and how? Yeah, central brain regions. How?
They sense, they have osmoreceptors?
If they're osmoreceptors, so their job is to detect changes in osmolality. Osmolality of what?
Solutes.
No, blood. So remember, one of those important fluids, extracellular fluids, is blood plasma. So as blood passes by these receptors, they're detecting the amount of dissolved substances in plasma.
But it's not much, there's not a lot of percentage of extracellular fluid from the plasma. Actually, there's more interstitial fluid. So how they detect...
But what's going to happen? They don't. The cells themselves are going to react to that. But with respect to the central nervous system, that's what it's going to monitor. Blood can tell a lot about what's going on in many of the systems. For example, in the urinary system, when I'm not filtering properly, I'm putting back more wastes into blood, more dissolved substances. When I'm not getting rid of enough hydrogen ions, what happens to blood?
More acidic.
Exactly. So blood is a very good monitor of how our systems are functioning. So extracellular osmolality and osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are the ones that are going to help send out messages to other systems to help regulate water balance when it becomes out of balance. So when I have increased ECF, extracellular fluid osmolality, what does that mean?
It means that there's more, if it's increasing,
Yep.
it means that from a particular region, I don't know, square of blood or plasma, there's a certain amount of soluble solutes.
So what does an
If
increase?
it's increased, then it's increased number of solutes.
Correct. Perfect. So we have an increased amount of dissolved substances in our extracellular fluids. We detect that. So what do we have to do? How do we fix it? We have to get more fluid into our body. And we have to decrease what? Output. Perfect. So who's going to get the message? Yeah, so the kidneys are going to play a role, but other water producers are also going to be affected as well. So if you look at this diagram here, we see that the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus get the message. Too many dissolved substances. I'm going to decrease saliva because what is most of saliva? Water, but what else? When I decrease saliva, what happens?
Osmolality will dry mouth.
Your mouth gets dry. Then what do you do when your mouth gets dry? Ah! Bing, bing, bing! That'll cause you to go do what? Go get a drink. So that's your signal. Your body's way of saying your osmolality is high. Your mouth gets dry. You are dehydrated. And what do? Easiest way to correct that is to get some fluid in you. So your thirst mechanism is extremely important because it's telling you that your dissolved substances in solution, your osmolality is high, and we need to get more fluids in to equalize that.
Why did you say that if osmolality will increase, we have to decrease,
Saliva.
output, right? Decrease output.
Correct.
So,
Output, urinary output.
yes, urinary.
So what are you going to have as far as urine goes? When you're dehydrated, and now
Reabsorption.
it's another way of saying I'm dehydrated. So what happens to urine output?
It's concentrated.
It's more concentrated, less what?
Water.
Because what am I going to do with that?
Your whole reabsorption.
I'm going to reabsorb more water in the process that we discussed in the kidneys and the nephron function. So more water is going to get reabsorbed in the juxtaglomerular nephrons in the loop of Henle. When, yes? So understand this diagram. Also, some hormones are going to help and play a role in affecting kidney function. So we see on the other side of the diagram that decreased volume can also be a trigger as well, because decreased volume indicates decrease, what's most of your blood plasma? Water. So when we have a decreased volume, that decrease in pressure is also going to be a trigger to this mechanism as well.
Those more concentrated urine will absorb in the
the juxtaglomerular, I hate that word, juxtaglomerular nephron will cause the, exactly, reabsorb more water.
Okay. So this is only with this nephron. Those nephrons.
Well, both of them do that, but we have a longer period of time in the big long ones because they're longer loops of Henle. So they'll kick in a little bit.
Reabsorb more water. Okay.
Correct. So that's what they talk about under regulation of water output. So do we reabsorb more water or do we reabsorb more of other things which end up having us reabsorb more water? And we use this term when we talk kidneys. You can see it under regulation of water output. The term we used when we described water following ions that were being reabsorbed. A few more words in there. Obligatory water reabsorption. So we're actually reabsorbing ions back into the circulatory system, and water will do what? Water will follow. Okay, some hormones like antidiuretic hormone are going to play a role in water balance here as well. So they talk about the influence of antidiuretic hormone. You already know all about that. Disorders of water balance, dehydration. Again, the quickest way for me to solve dehydration problems is to do what? Well, drink, yes, but what if I can't drink? And I have to maintain fluid compartments within my body based on system function.
Reabsorb the water.
Exactly. In the nephrons, in the kidney, reabsorb more sodium, which allows me to reabsorb more water. Okay, so kind of repetitive information in this diagram shows us when the osmolality goes up, we increase sodium concentration in plasma because we're actually reabsorbing more sodium, so we can in turn reabsorb more what? More water. Terms that we already know come into play like hypotonic. Understand or review terms like hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic. So that again, those concentrations of dissolved substances in fluid are going to dictate fluid compartments as well. So if I drink way, way, way too much water, for example, my solutions, extracellular solutions, are going to be hypotonic. What's going to happen to my cells? Now, water is going to very quickly equalize on either side of the cell. So again, we know this already, and we're reviewing it here. So, yeah, it was a contest.
Water, yeah, I guess they discovered that
Yeah, water.
Yeah. Now, mechanisms in our body are going to cause us to get rid of excess fluid. So the renal system is going to come into play when we have excess fluid too. But what was the contest?
it
It was something.
They had to drink so much water, and and whoever went to the bathroom first lost. Like they had to hold their urine. It was something they were.
For a car.
No, it was for a week.
Hold your weed.
Oh, it was a
Hold your
week.
wee for a week.
Oh, was it?
Yes.
Wasn't even a car.
$250 clients.
And this woman died. Yeah.
Commit suicide.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think those contents, you know,
Oh, yeah.
you know, they
Craziness.
so many hamburgers or
Mhm.
you know whatever. It's just craziness. They have to
Absolutely.
do this.
I know.
I think those things are funny.
They're fun.
And they train them.
They're kind of gross.
Eat all that. Because one of them is just a little girl. She's like 90 pounds, and she thinks she weighs 30.
All those hot dogs, yeah.
And had they like dip them in water? Yeah.
So disturbances in water balance can cause problems with cellular function. Too much fluid, too little fluid inside cells. So again, these ion concentrations are going to dictate indirectly fluid compartments inside and outside cells. So they revisit the hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic discussion from the beginning of anatomy. When fluid compartments can't handle the excess fluid, and we talked about this when we talked lymphatic system, what was one of the jobs of the lymphatic system besides the whole immune response? And, huh? Excess water that has done what? Think about where the lymphatic system begins. Begins, the littlest parts, in the capillary beds. So when we see exchange of fluids through the capillary beds, that excess fluid that leaves the circulatory system and doesn't have time to get back into the circulatory system is picked up by the lymphatic system and thrown back eventually into the circulatory system. When pressure gradients are messed up, we have problems getting that excess fluid that's left the circulatory system into the lymphatic system. And so they give us a little bit of again, repeat information about edema, building up of fluid in the extremities typically outside capillary beds.
Extremities, you mean
These are your extremities. Arms and legs, so feet and hands. Well, and it could also be an imbalance, an ion imbalance in your fluid compartments. So think, because remember, we're talking fluid compartments here. Pressure can also create an abnormal balance in fluid compartments as well. So that's why the discussion here.
I didn't realize, but because I was talking to the nurse about his weight, I thought his weight was wrong, but it was literally fluid. He had gained
Yep.
30 or 40 pounds, and I was like, I thought that someone messed up, and she's like, no, that's fluid.
No, when my father was just recently in for surgery, he's got decreased kidney function. So he has problems with fluid imbalance. So after his surgery, in 2 weeks, just in fluid alone, he lost 16 pounds from the excess fluid his body was accumulated that he was getting rid of. So yeah, it can, and that's one of the things is, as a clinician that you will do with patients that have decreased kidney function or any disease that causes imbalances in fluid compartments. One of the most important things for you to do every single day is what?
Monitor their weight.
Exactly, weigh your patient.
I know, and they get so mad, but you weighed me yesterday.
I know.
We have to weigh you every
Yeah,
day.
because that you can quickly see with a gain of a couple of pounds in a day that your patient is holding on to too many fluids, or the opposite if you're monitoring fluid loss. So your weight is important.
A lot of times in facilities too, you monitor their output, like CC, so you know how much intake
what
and
they're drinking and what
Exactly. So again, what patients are we looking at? Any patient that has a disease that's affecting fluid compartments. So you're going to see that this is important information in the clinical setting. Table 26.1, causes and consequences of electrolyte imbalances. Just a general idea and some of these general terms, because you will hear them in a clinical setting. Hypernatremia, too much what? Sodium. Hypo, too little. Understand some of the consequences. Okay, what's going to happen if these levels are off? As far as possible causes go, don't worry about that too much. As you discuss disease states and when you talk, hopefully in your next endeavor after this class, guess what your next class will be? Yeah, pathophysiology. You'll talk about some of the different causes and diseases associated with these fluid compartment imbalances. So I'm not going to get too crazy about that right now because you'll talk about that in pathophysiology.
So will you do pathophysiology here?
No, we don't have it on the books yet. No, we're working on it though. It probably won't be till,
Next.
2015 spring or, 15. Yeah, things work slow.
Are you going to take it?
Oh, I hope so. I got to get it on the books first. So we'll see. But, so know those terms, hyperkalemia, phosphatemia, and K, potassium, kalemia. Phosphates, again, they're important ions that can control water compartments. Chloride, calcium, magnesium. So just be familiar with those terms and understand what the consequences might be. So if your potassium is off, for example, what's some of the things I might see in my patient? Electrolyte imbalances, cramps, nausea, vomiting, heart rhythm, arrhythmias. Okay, so yes, exactly, because sodium-potassium balance is very important for who? Yeah, neuron and neuron function. So you can get consequences like that as well. So it's important to understand the consequences of an imbalance. So I do want you to know that. Yes?
Last year at Temple, when I was at Temple, they had a patient that was brought to the emergency room and they were so confused. They thought they had some kind of head injury or something because they were talking like they had had dementia or something.
Mm-hmm.
Remember their names, stuff like that. And they did a panel, an electrolyte panel, and their sodium, I mean their potassium was so off
Mm-hmm.
that she wound up getting a drip of potassium in it. And after like a couple days
Night and
later,
day, right?
it was night and day, and you were just like, no way. Like,
But that's what, you know, and again, you know, we think of something so small, but how it can affect so many different reactions of metabolism in the body. Of dehydration, nausea, vomiting, certain medications can cause you to void more potassium than necessary. So there's tons of different diseases, usually renal associated diseases.
Okay, can you give us like, because there's a lot of things that they share, like for example sodium and potassium, if it's imbalance, they have similar consequences.
Correct.
So if you will ask us like an exam, I would say, like question about something, we might, you know, think about sodium or potassium.
Correct. And when I ask the question, I'm going to make sure that I word it so that it's very clear as to what
Because there's
I'm
a lot of
asking.
similarity.
Yeah. And again, ion balance. Ions, exactly. What positive and negative ions are going to have similar effect. Okay. So sodium concentration versus sodium content. Don't worry about that. Regulation of sodium balance. We know some of the hormones already. We've discussed them when we discussed the renal system and when we discussed hormones in the endocrine system. So aldosterone and angiotensin II, again, we revisit the same information that we learned before. Atrial natriuretic peptide, we already know what that does for a living as well. And that's going to be secreted by what?
Heart,
And
reduce blood pressure.
right, so baroreceptors are going to pick up on the increase in pressure in the system. What's the fastest way, because we're talking fluid electrolytes, what's the fastest way to decrease pressure in the system?
Decrease.
Yep, empty it,
Increase,
exactly.
Urine output.
Right, increase water content, urine output. How am I going to get more water in urine faster? Well, antidiuretic's going to hold it on.
It's the diverter.
Well, it's the aldosterone, and think my brain just went dead. The ones that sit on top of the kidneys, adrenals. Okay, so the adrenals are going to help us regulate balance in that way.
So
We see that guy.
aldosterone will keep up for more sodium, so for absorption of sodium, and then the water will follow, right?
Correct. So basically, a lot of this chapter is repeat information from what you know already. Some other hormones that can actually affect water compartments, estrogen, progesterone, those are reproductive. When we think reproductive, we have secondary characteristics or secondary effects of a lot of these hormones. And one of the secondary effects of some of these reproductive hormones that we're going to talk about in the next chapter also have an effect on sodium reabsorption and secretion in the renal tubules. It's not in that one. I don't think there's a diagram for that one. It's on page 1000 in the textbook. So again, estrogen and progesterone.
Okay.
We also have the glucocorticoids, cholesterol, cortisol, hydrocortisol. They're going to enhance tubular reabsorption of sodium, which is going to then enhance the reabsorption of what? Water. Okay. Cardiovascular baroreceptors. That was my A&P friend. Again, monitoring pressure. The quickest way to affect pressure is to either put water in if pressure is too low or take water out when pressure is too high. So again, what you know the consequences in the nephrons and what we need to do. You know the hormones associated with either getting rid of or holding on to water. So basically it's a repeat of that information. This one here, we see the mechanism and consequence of atrial natriuretic peptide release. So when pressure goes too high, what do we need to do? Get the volume in the circulatory system low, and we have to do that fast. So there's a couple of different ways to do that. Vasodilation is going to decrease pressure by opening up the blood vessels. It's also going to allow for what to happen at a faster rate. When I open up those blood vessels, more exchange of fluids between the circulatory system and whatever system. Well, in this case, whatever system are we talking about? Yeah, the kidneys and the renal system. So we're going to be able to get more fluid out at a faster rate. Decrease antidiuretic hormone because I don't want to hold on to the fluid. I want to get rid of the fluid. And that's going to help decrease pressure by decreasing volume in the system fast. So again, we had this discussion when we talked endocrine system and how a hormone can have an effect on several different systems. We see it come into play here. So atrial natriuretic, that big AMP, can affect all of these guys, which will end result decrease blood pressure. Okay? So regulation of potassium, and this chapter has the psychotic diagrams in it, but basically it's all repeat information from all of the other things we've discussed already.
How rid of potassium through urine as well? Right?
Correct. So you're going to get rid of it. Diuretics will help you get rid of it. Unfortunately, patients on diuretics sometimes have too low a potassium, so they have to have a supplement of potassium as well. Because one of the ways to get rid of the excess fluid is to cause those tubules to get rid of the excess ions. So that's one of the downfalls of diuretics. Can also cause an electrolyte imbalance in the too low end.
Is that because it's passing fluids too quickly that things can't
Well,
absorb?
Well, and you're causing those tubules to get rid of those excess ions. That's what's getting rid of the excess water. So unfortunately, in order to get rid of the excess water, that's the only way we can do it. That's how our mechanisms work. And unfortunately, it leads to an imbalance in ions. So you have to kind of supplement your patients with either potassium supplements or try to get them to eat foods higher in some of those ions to help balance ion deficiencies. So again, repeat information. We see renin and angiotensin coming into play again. To decrease, when I have a decreased systemic blood volume, what do I have to do? And this is what I want you to ask yourself, because the answer to your question will cause everything to make sense. What do I have to do when decreased systemic blood pressure and volume is on board? I need to increase volume. Exactly. One of the quickest ways to do that, and hold on to more water. So you see, bam, smack dab in the middle, the kidneys roll, and some of the hormones like renin and angiotensin and adrenal cortex hormones like aldosterone and their effect on the kidney tubules, reabsorption of more water, which is going to result in the increase of blood volume. Pituitary gland also, and its antidiuretic hormone is also going to cause us to do what to volume as well? Reabsorb more water. So that's another player in this equation that's going to cause us to very quickly get more volume water-wise in the circulatory system, which will increase blood pressure when it's too low.
When we reabsorb sodium, we at the same time reabsorb potassium as well?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
A lot of, and if you think of the cell itself and a lot of the receptors itself, many cells have a sodium-potassium pump.
Yeah.
So you sometimes see an intake and output of one versus the other. So you don't necessarily reabsorb both of them. So it's different mechanism to reabsorb sodium versus potassium. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So aldosterone is mentioned here as well. Calcium and phosphate balance, also very important, not only for some of the stuff we've already discussed, like bones and all of that good stuff, but also important when we talk about fluid compartments. So PTH, parathyroid hormone, can have an effect on calcium and phosphate balance. We talked about this when we talked about the thyroid producing calcitonin and the parathyroid producing parathyroid hormone. So everybody remembers that, right? So when I secrete parathyroid hormone, what happens?
Secrete.
Mm-hmm.
It will reabsorb calcium.
Well,
Be-
releases calcium because it's going to stimulate who?
bones to kidney.
Osteoclast, exactly. Actually, it's going to stimulate monocytes that are in the circulatory system to differentiate into osteoclasts and break down bone matrix. So again, you know this, so what you basically have to do is go in and kind of dust off the cobwebs for this chapter. Okay, and again, calcium and phosphate balance, again, by some of the similar mechanisms that we've learned and some of the similar hormones that we've learned already. Now, with respect to acid-base balance, what is the definition of pH?
Concentration of
No, it's
hydrogen
Logarithmic
ions.
scale of hydrogen.
correct. So it's a concentration of
Proton.
hydrogen ions in solution. Yes? The higher the concentration of hydrogen ions in solution, what does that do to the pH? It decreases that number, because remember when we had, and this is, we're really dusting off some I think it's moles per liter or millimoles per liter. This is pH 7. Yes? That means what?
It means that in milliliters or liters, I don't know, can't remember.
Neutral.
Doesn't matter.
Cancels out.
Correct. The concentration of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions or hydroxyl ions are equal. 10 to the minus 7 moles per liter. Yes? That's pH 7. What do we call that? Neutral. Yes? So what happens when we get this? What happens to this number?
Acidic. It became 86. Then it's acidic, and if it's 8, it's
So this is OH. Remember, the definition of pH is what? Hydrogen ions in solution. So that number is bigger or smaller than this number?
bigger.
It's bigger. It's a minus number. Yes? So minus 6 is bigger than minus 8. Yes? pH is 6. That means there's a higher concentration of hydrogen ions in solution than hydroxyl ions in solution. We have to maintain a very tight pH in our fluid compartments. What is normal pH for humans? 7.35 to 7.45. So it's slightly what?
Slightly alkaline.
Slightly alkaline, slightly basic. That concentration of hydrogen ions in solution is going to determine that pH, correct? So in fluid compartments, we have many different compounds that are going to help maintain hydrogen ion balance. We talked about hydrogen ion balance when we talked about the respiratory system, didn't we? Oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations and the formation of carbonic acid. Remember that crazy reaction? If I have too much CO2, I'm going to make too much what? Carbonic acid, which is going to dissociate into hydrogen ions, and what's going to happen to the pH? It will become more acidic. Okay? So controlling hydrogen ions in these fluid compartments is extremely important. I know you think you don't know this, but you do know it already. She's like, oh yeah, sure we do. So when I add to that beaker of water, and what is water, by the way? Yep. And when it dissociates, what do I get? OH minus. What's OH minus? Oh yeah, see? Hydroxyl, or there's so many different names for it. Hydroxide ions is what I call them. Okay. So when I add substances through chemical reactions to that water in fluid compartments, some of those substances are going to cause the water to dissociate and form more either hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions. So we have different chemicals that are going to help balance hydrogen ion concentration, and these guys are called buffers. They're either going to contribute ions or take away excess ions to help maintain pH in the system. Again, pH and the concentration of hydrogen ions in solution is extremely important for reactions of metabolism. Too much or too little is going to mess up my chemistry. 7.35 to 7.45. So the chemical buffer systems they discuss in this book are extremely important to help maintain pH. Think about the vast number of chemical reactions that you've already discussed and how hydrogen ion concentration is constantly changing. So basically I just want you, I'm not going to get crazy about specific reactions and reactants and products, and we don't even have to go there. But I want you to be familiar with the different buffer system names. So we have a bicarbonate buffer system, and that's the most common one. When you do an electrolyte panel, what's the last one on the list? You have sodium, you have potassium, you have chlorine, you have bicarbonate. Yes? HCO3, right? Correct. H2CO3, I'm sorry, I've got the two. So bicarbonate buffer system in the body, very common buffer system in the body that's going to help maintain pH. So the amount of bicarbonate ions in my blood plasma is extremely important to help maintain pH. Again, ion balance is important to maintain fluid compartments. It's gonna take up through this reaction, that reaction we see on page 1005. If we have a strong acid, for example, and a weak base, when we add them together, that bicarbonate is going to help by taking up some of those ions and creating or having the ability to create salt. And the salt is just going to be removed.
So it's transfer strong base or strong acid to the weak one?
Correct. Less hydrogen ions in solution floating around. Phosphate buffer system Again, same thing, different mechanism, different reaction. Proteins are, you don't have to know the specific equations, no. But they're basically, you're going to see the same, repetitive same thing. Strong and weak acid to weak base, or strong and weak acid to weak acid. You're going to see a neutralization based on these different reactions. Proteins are extremely important in maintaining fluid compartments. Have you ever seen those terrible commercials, and usually you start seeing them around now, of severely malnutrition children in third world countries? And you see that terrible ascites belly that they have. That's not, what is that? It's fluid. It's fluid that we can't maintain in the proper compartments. So that fluid, because of such severe protein deficiencies, has a problem staying inside the cells or staying inside places where it should be. And it leaks out into fluid, extracellular fluid compartments. Both. Extracellular is interstitial. Yes?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
I mean, it's not plasma that is,
No, it's
between
correct.
cells.
Correct. So extracellular interstitial fluid. So we start to see filling up of those compartments. Because because of the protein imbalance, they have trouble with proper function in the renal system as well.
So those protein molecules, which is making negative
Inside cells.
a cell, so they're lacking those proteins, so that it's becoming more
Lesser in concentration, so they could have imbalances in membrane potential as well. And that's going to mess with tonicity, and that's going to mess with osmotic balance, and it's just one big, huge mess with respect to fluid compartments. And again, it's fluid leaking out of the cells when it should be inside the cells. Then will lead to problems with concentration of ions inside and out of the cells, so it exacerbates the problem. So protein balance is extremely important. We already talked about respiratory regulation of hydrogen ion balances when we talked about that very familiar reaction, which we see on page 1006. I don't think so, no. This is the carbonic anhydrase. It's another buffer system. And what's PCT? PCT. No. Think fluid balance. Who's responsible for that really quick? Kidneys. PCT.
Oh, this is
Proximal convoluted tubules, exactly. So this is basically the mechanism, chemical mechanism of reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubules. No, you don't need to know. No. So you are familiar with respiratory regulation. You are familiar with that reaction that results in the formation of carbonic anhydrase and then bicarbonate ions. And remember, bicarbonate ions are what? Isn't that part of a buffer system we just mentioned? So those bicarbonate ions are going to help maintain the proper pH, hydrogen ion concentration.
volatile acid.
Oh, non-volatile and volatile acid is, well, what's volatile mean? Yeah, reactive. It can be damaging. Well, when we talk about metabolism, think reactive. So volatile versus non-volatile, quick chemical reaction versus slower chemical reaction, both resulting in changes in hydrogen ion concentration in extracellular fluids. They talk a little bit about bicarbonate ions and their importance in buffer system. Again, a lot of repeat information.
What exactly we need to know for...
Just be familiar with bicarbonate ion buffer system and how it neutralizes pH. or helps to neutralize pH. I'm not going to make you know any of the details of the reactions. Don't worry about it. Yeah. And so ammonia is something that we excrete to help maintain pH balance as well. If I look at some of the constituents of urine, the components of urine, ammonia is one of those as well. When we start to see large amounts of ammonia secreted, that might be an indicator of some other organism on board who's creating more ammonia. Who could that be? In our urine. Yep. When urine pH starts to go high. Yeah, bacteria. So one of the metabolic waste products of bacterial metabolism is ammonia as well. So we start to see excess excretion of that in the urine if we have
But that also causes it to smell more.
ammonia E. Is that a word? Ammonia-like. All right, so absorption and secretion of these ions is important to help maintain pH. When we start seeing abnormalities in balance, it can be due to some of the major systems that help to maintain that balance. So we see definitions of respiratory acidosis caused by what? And it's respiratory acidosis. So too much, well, that's going to be the result, but what, think about the, yeah. So too much what in the system? Too much CO2 in the system, exactly. So respiratory acidosis, for whatever reason, and one of the things is if I have too much carbon dioxide in the system, I can't get rid of it at a fast enough rate.
I cannot
or
hold on for more oxygen as well.
Opposite. Would you say? Go opposite. Hypoventilate. Okay, holding on to too much. Hyperventilate would be the opposite. And that would cause what? Respiratory alkalosis, because I'd be getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. Basically, that reaction would go in the opposite direction.
Is it connected to oxygen as well? Oxygen, what is it?
Well, if I have too much,
Unloading?
yeah,
Right.
and so they kind of go hand in hand. Too much carbon dioxide would be not enough what? Oxygen. Too much oxygen would be correct. Okay, and again, think about the load and offload of the ions in gas exchange for the hemoglobin molecule. Okay?
Pretty much hyperventilation, it's you're not breathing of excess of carbon dioxide, right?
Hypo, yes, not enough. Too much carbon dioxide. Hyper would be getting rid of too much, not holding on to enough. So even though it's a waste gas, the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide is important to maintain the proper pH in the system. Then reactions of metabolism can cause the same thing. So we see definitions of metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. Again, metabolic acidosis would be whatever reactions that were increased in producing too many hydrogen ions in solution. Metabolic alkalosis would be producing not enough hydrogen ions and too many hydroxide ions in solution. When I mess with the pH, I mess with cellular metabolism in general. So it gives you a general overview. Nervous system is the first one. Can lead to death and coma, nervousness, convulsions, can all be result of problems with pH. So in this table, 26.3 on page 1010 in your textbook, we see basic definitions of respiratory alkalosis and acidosis and metabolic acidosis and alkalosis.
Do we need to know numbers?
No, you don't need to know numbers. Too many numbers to know. When you go into medical lab science, you can know the numbers. You don't have to know them. Trying to think of I want you to know what happens to the patient when they have these conditions.
The causes, possible causes?
Yeah, I don't want you to have to know them all, though. I want you to know things like, for example, when they define respiratory acidosis, I want you to understand that it's going to disrupt lung function. Don't worry about the narcotics and barbiturates and overdose. So basically the results physically of the condition, and not necessarily having to know all of the reasons why. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Good. That's it. We're done with chapter
How about
26.
metabolic acidosis and alcohol?
Yep, same thing. So if we have metabolic alkalosis, vomiting, gastric issues, don't worry about what causes it, like diuretics or ingestion of excessive sodium bicarbonate, okay?
Just say that it was vomiting and gastric, it would cause vomiting and gastric issues.
Correct. So know the effects on the system. You don't have to know the why can't I talk today? Yeah, what caused it? That's too much stuff.
So where is it? Because
It's basically the first line of every single one.
Yeah.
it's all in that chart.
So when you look in this chart, it would be the first line. Know that, so severe diarrhea for metabolic acidosis, vomiting and gastric suctioning for metabolic
Okay,
alkalosis.
so
You don't have to know this.
First.
Yeah, basically the first, is it the first line for every single one of them? I think it is. Yep, strong emotions.
Respiratory alkalosis. What's the main cause? Hypoxemia
No, you don't,
or strong?
just have to know the result. So you'd get pain, anxiety, fear, panic.
The top one, acidosis, is impaired lung function, basically,
Right.
And for the
So don't worry.
alkalosis-
So the first line of every single one.
Okay.
So the first line, okay? These are causes. Don't worry about that. Because there's just too many of them. And then they're missing half of them anyway, so don't worry about it. Okay, so you're done with chapter 27. Want to go to 26? Jeez.
That is the point.
I know.
Can we go into our homework, please?
You sure you don't want to do chapter 27 now?
Please.
Reproductive system.
Please.
Okay.
You know how many questions Dr. Carden gave us for
257.
The
How
fetal pig
much?
mastering.
Did you count them?
Oh.
The mastering and
500.
the fetal pig.
No. Both. 500.
They're both due
He said
next
the
week.
last two.
Yeah, I know it's not due next week, but I'm saying that, for the rest of
It's
this
psychotic.
500 questions.
But don't you guys all
It's
use that one?
psychotic. Yeah,
It's horrible.
it is horrible.
I love.
I didn't make it.